There is a moment in Culpa Tuya when the fantasy that Noah and Nick have been protecting begins to collapse under the weight of everything they refuse to confront. What once felt like a private rebellion against everyone who told them their relationship was impossible now feels like something far more unstable. Two people trying to convince themselves that intensity is the same thing as security. That distinction is the key to understanding this sequel. Culpa Tuya is easy to dismiss as another guilty pleasure romance built from jealousy, beautiful people, expensive cars, dramatic parties, betrayals, and impossible emotional decisions. But dismissing it that way misses the mechanism that makes the movie so effective. The chaos is not an accident. The film keeps escalating because Noah and Nick's relationship survives almost entirely through escalation. Every obstacle makes them cling harder. Every secret makes the eventual confession more explosive. Every moment of tenderness becomes more valuable because the audience already knows it can disappear. The forbidden stepbrother premise is therefore more than a familiar YA hook. It creates an environment where ordinary romantic problems become existential threats. A disagreement is never just a disagreement. Distance becomes abandonment. Jealousy becomes proof. Attraction becomes possession. And a secret can destroy an entire emotional world. That is why Culpa Tuya works best when viewed not simply as a romance, but as a case study in romantic addiction. Noah and Nick are addicted to the emotional intensity that surrounds them, and the film repeatedly asks whether they actually know how to love each other without the crisis. The strange irony is that the movie's greatest weakness and greatest strength come from the same source. Its melodrama can feel excessive, yet that excess mirrors the emotional environment experienced by a generation raised inside constant digital comparison, accelerated intimacy, public relationship performance, and fear of being replaced. Modern romance can be incredibly connected and incredibly insecure at the same time. Culpa Tuya turns that contradiction into entertainment. Its characters live in a world where one glance, one message, one photograph, or one rumor can completely alter the meaning of a relationship. The movie exaggerates those anxieties, but it does not invent them. It amplifies them until every emotion becomes cinematic. And that is the central thesis of this entire breakdown. Culpa Tuya is not popular despite its chaos. It is popular because its chaos transforms familiar anxieties into an addictive emotional spectacle. To understand why that spectacle works, however, we have to look beyond the plot. A simple recap can tell us what Noah and Nick do, but it cannot explain why audiences remain emotionally attached, even when their decisions become frustrating. That requires us to examine the architecture underneath the romance. We need to look at how the sequel distributes information, how it creates misunderstandings, how it uses physical spaces to separate characters, and how its visual language changes whenever trust begins to fracture. We also need to examine the adaptation itself because Culpa Tuya arrives with a history. It is not an original screenplay appearing in isolation. It is the screen continuation of a story that already existed inside Mercedes Ron's Culpables universe, a property whose emotional appeal was established long before cameras rolled. That means the filmmakers are constantly balancing two audiences. Viewers who want the emotional beats they remember from the books and viewers who are encountering Noah and Nick primarily through the screen. The difference matters because internal monologue is one of the most powerful tools in romantic fiction. A novel can tell us exactly what a character is thinking in the instant before they make a terrible decision. Cinema has to find another language. A pause, a look, a cut, a song, a change in lighting, a physical distance between two actors. These become substitutes for thoughts that can no longer simply be written on the page. So throughout this essay, we will move through three interconnected layers. First, the psychology, what Noah and Nick actually want, what they fear, and why they repeatedly confuse protection with control. Second, the filmmaking, how cinematography, editing, staging, sound, cars, parties, mirrors, and spaces convert emotional instability into visual storytelling. And third, the cultural machine surrounding the film, the Wattpad origins, the book fandom, the streaming ecosystem, social media circulation, and the changing appetite for international YA romance. Because Culpa Tuya is not merely a story that happened to become successful, it is a product perfectly positioned inside a streaming era, where emotional immediacy can travel across languages faster than traditional prestige narratives. The question is not simply whether the movie is good. The more interesting question is why this particular kind of movie can generate such intense loyalty. And if you were already emotionally invested in the Culpables trilogy before watching Culpa Tuya, that question becomes even more complicated. Mercedes Ron's books built an audience around a relationship that was never supposed to be simple. The attraction between Noah and Nick was designed around prohibition, friction, vulnerability, and the fantasy that two people can create their own world when everyone around them says they should not. For readers, those feelings had room to breathe. Pages could linger inside Noah's uncertainty or Nick's jealousy. Readers could spend entire stretches of the story inside their emotional logic. The film has less time, less interior access, and a different responsibility. It has to make those emotions visible. That creates the first major tension between expectation and reality. Fans may remember an internal experience from the books, while the screen adaptation can only recreate the external expression of that experience. Sometimes that translation works beautifully. Sometimes it makes the same behavior feel more extreme because we are watching it rather than reading the character's justification for it. This is why the movie can simultaneously feel faithful and different. The events may resemble what audiences expected, but their emotional texture changes when performed by actors, surrounded by music, editing, production design, and the visual grammar of contemporary streaming romance. Even the most casual viewer is therefore participating in a translation process without realizing it. And hidden inside that translation are details worth noticing. Recurring spaces that change meaning, visual contrasts between intimacy and isolation, moments where characters are physically close but emotionally disconnected, and objects that quietly reinforce the idea that Noah and Nick are constantly living between two identities. The more closely we examine those choices, the clearer the larger pattern becomes. Culpa Tuya is about people trying to maintain control, while everything around them accelerates beyond control. The racing, the parties, the family expectations, the romantic threats, and the sudden reversals are not isolated decorations. They all belong to the same emotional system. And once we recognize that system, the sequel stops looking like random melodrama and starts looking like a carefully engineered escalation of pressure. The origins of that pressure begin long before the sequel. Culpa Tuya exists at the intersection of two entertainment cultures that once seemed almost completely separate: online serialized fiction and multinational streaming cinema. Mercedes Ron's Culpables story emerged from the kind of digital ecosystem where readers do not simply consume a story, they participate in its momentum. Wattpad transformed the relationship between author and audience by allowing serialized narratives to accumulate communities in real time. Readers comment, recommend, quote, remix, argue, and create expectations around characters while the story is still becoming itself. That environment is especially powerful for romance, because romance thrives on anticipation. The question is not merely what happens next. It is whether two characters will finally confess, whether they will separate, whether a rival will interfere, whether a secret will be revealed, and whether the emotional payoff will be worth the wait. Those mechanisms naturally create highly engaged audiences, and they also create valuable intellectual property for studios searching for established fan bases. The transition from Wattpad sensation to international streaming franchise therefore represents more than a change of format. It represents a change in scale. What begins as a reader-driven romantic fantasy eventually becomes a polished audiovisual property capable of traveling across markets. That transition creates enormous creative opportunities, but it also introduces constraints. A novel can afford ambiguity because readers control the pace. A streaming film has to maintain momentum. A novel can describe internal conflict for pages. A film must externalize it. A novel can make a character's jealousy feel sympathetic because the narration explains its origin. On screen, the same jealousy can look possessive before the audience has enough context to understand it. The filmmakers therefore have to preserve the emotional identity of Mercedes Ron's world, while making it legible to viewers who may know nothing about the books. That means recognizable romantic archetypes remain intact, but their presentation becomes more cinematic, more international, and more immediately accessible. There is also a practical dimension to expanding the culpables universe. Sequels of this scale require continuity not just in story but in audience memory. Characters must feel familiar while their circumstances change. The emotional promise of the first film has to survive, but repeating the exact same conflict would make the sequel feel unnecessary. Culpa Tuya consequently needs to make Noah and Nick older without making them emotionally stable. They are moving toward adulthood, but the movie understands that growing older does not automatically mean becoming healthier. University, career ambitions, family expectations, new social circles, and greater independence should theoretically make their lives broader. Instead, these new freedoms create more opportunities for secrecy and insecurity. The sequel can therefore expand the physical world, while tightening the psychological pressure. That is one of its most important structural decisions. The production challenge is especially significant because the Culpables films operate as parts of a larger romantic narrative rather than completely independent stories. The filmmakers have to maintain chemistry across installments while allowing conflict to evolve. The actors must communicate a history that the audience already believes exists, even when the characters are not saying everything aloud. The production design must create a world luxurious enough to support the fantasy while still leaving room for emotional claustrophobia. And the pacing must continually answer the same question: what can happen next that will make the relationship feel even more threatened? That question is both the engine and the danger of the sequel. Escalation creates retention, but escalation without transformation becomes repetition. Culpa Tuya survives by continually changing the source of the pressure. First, the threat seems external. Then it becomes social. Then personal. Then psychological. Eventually, the most dangerous obstacle is no longer the outside world at all. It is what Noah and Nick have become to each other. That evolution mattered enormously because the sequel did not arrive in a vacuum. Culpa Mia had already established the franchise as a major streaming event, meaning Culpa Tuya carried a burden that the first film never had. The original could surprise audiences, The sequel had to satisfy them. The first movie's success created a paradox. Everyone wanted more Noah and Nick, but the more successful the relationship became as a fantasy, the harder it became to preserve its dramatic tension. If they were simply happy for 2 hours, there would be no story. If they fought constantly, the audience might become exhausted. The sequel therefore needed to offer both reward and threat, intimacy and instability, confirmation and betrayal. That is where the modern streaming environment becomes crucial. A platform does not necessarily need every viewer to love a film in the same way. It needs viewers to care enough to continue watching, talk about it, share clips, revisit scenes, and move into the next installment. Romance is particularly useful in this environment because its most emotional moments are highly portable. A dramatic kiss can become a short video. A confrontation can become a quote. A look between two characters can become an edit. A song can become attached to a pairing and travel independently of the film. The movie therefore exists in two forms at once: the complete feature and the fragmented emotional moments that circulate through social media. TikTok fan edits, Instagram teasers, cast interviews, reaction videos, and chemistry-focused promotional material all contribute to that ecosystem. The marketing does not simply sell the plot. It sells the relationship. It tells viewers that Noah and Nick are an event worth returning to. Their chemistry becomes promotional material in itself. The actors' public interactions can reinforce the fictional pairing, while carefully selected clips can remind existing fans of the emotional stakes without revealing every narrative turn. This strategy is especially effective for a franchise built around romantic anticipation, because the audience already understands the language of longing. A glance can function as a trailer. A song can function as a promise. A single frame can reignite an entire fandom. The broader streaming market also explains why an international Spanish-language romance can become strategically valuable. Platforms increasingly need stories that can travel beyond their country of origin, without requiring enormous Hollywood budgets. Melodrama is naturally adaptable because its emotional vocabulary is universal. Family conflict, jealousy, forbidden desire, betrayal, ambition, insecurity, and reconciliation do not require the viewer to share the character's nationality. What matters is whether the emotional stakes are immediately understandable. Culpa Tuya sits directly inside that opportunity. Its Spanish identity gives it a specific cultural texture, while its romantic structure makes it globally legible. But the true test begins when the sequel leaves the safety of expectation and places Noah and Nick into a world that no longer allows their relationship to exist as an isolated fantasy. At the beginning, the central illusion is that Noah and Nick have already survived the hardest part. They have crossed the line everyone told them not to cross. They have admitted their attraction. They have endured the emotional explosion surrounding their relationship. And now, theoretically, they should be able to move forward. But this is exactly where Culpa Tuya understands something important about romantic storytelling. Overcoming the obstacle that prevented a relationship from beginning does not mean the relationship itself is healthy enough to survive. Noah is entering a new stage of life. University represents independence, opportunity, and the possibility of defining herself outside the structures that previously controlled her. Nick, meanwhile, carries his own ambitions and responsibilities. Their lives are becoming larger, but their relationship still behaves as though it is the center of the universe. That mismatch creates the first pressure point. They want adulthood without fully accepting what adulthood demands. Independence means having separate experiences, Trust means allowing someone to have those experiences without interpreting every unknown as a threat. The early moments of the sequel therefore carry an uneasy contradiction. Noah and Nick appear more confident because they have already fought for each other. Yet they are also more vulnerable because now they have something to lose. In the first stage of their romance, uncertainty creates excitement. In the sequel, uncertainty becomes frightening. Once love has been established, the question changes from will they get together to can they remain together? That is a much more psychologically difficult question. University introduces an entirely new social environment. New people do not know the history between Noah and Nick. They do not automatically accept the boundaries that the couple has constructed. They see attractive, complicated young adults rather than characters locked inside a romantic destiny. That matters because relationships often feel secure inside familiar environments and fragile when exposed to unfamiliar ones. Noah now has access to people who knew nothing about her past. Nick encounters people who may not care about his carefully maintained image. Their relationship is suddenly being observed by outsiders who are free to interpret it differently. At the same time, family expectations continue to shape their choices. The adults around them have already demonstrated that love and control can become dangerously intertwined. Their parents believe they are protecting the younger generation, but their methods frequently produce secrecy rather than honesty. The irony is impossible to ignore. The people demanding responsible behavior often create the exact environment in which irresponsible behavior becomes necessary. When young adults feel that every truth will be punished, hiding becomes a survival strategy. That is why the arrival of new figures becomes so disruptive. Briar, Sophia, and people connected to earlier emotional wounds do not need to destroy Noah and Nick directly. They only need to expose weaknesses that already exist. The strongest antagonist in this story is often not a person. It is uncertainty. A new friend, an old connection, a suspicious interaction, or an unexplained absence can become meaningful because Noah and Nick already carry unresolved fears. Their private bubble begins to disappear. Parties create opportunities for misunderstandings. Social pressure makes ordinary interactions look suspicious. Distance makes communication less reliable. A message that is unanswered for an hour can feel like rejection. A conversation seen from across a room can look completely different from the conversation itself. These are exaggerated versions of problems that modern relationships understand intimately. The smartphone age has made communication instantaneous, while making interpretation more unstable. We can reach someone at almost any moment, yet that accessibility creates the expectation that silence must mean something. Culpa tuya turns that contradiction into narrative fuel. Noah wants autonomy, but she also wants reassurance. Nick wants trust, but he often seeks control when he feels threatened. Each character therefore asks the other to provide something they have difficulty providing for themselves. Noah expects Nick to prove that she will not be abandoned. Nick expects Noah to prove that he will not be betrayed. Neither demand can ever be completely satisfied because both are rooted in fear rather than evidence. This is where the sequel crosses an important threshold. The story stops being about whether external forces will permit Noah and Nick to love each other, and becomes about whether Noah and Nick can prevent their own fears from destroying the relationship. The forbidden romance has become a systemic relationship problem. And once that happens, the new social world becomes a pressure chamber. Parties are no longer simply glamorous settings. They become environments where information is incomplete. People drink, flirt, disappear, observe, speculate, and react. The more crowded the room, the more isolated Noah or Nick can feel. The film repeatedly creates situations where physical proximity does not guarantee emotional connection. They can be standing only a few feet apart and still feel worlds away from each other. The introduction of Briar and Sophia intensifies this effect because both function differently from simple romantic rivals. Their importance lies in what they reveal about Noah and Nick. A third person can create jealousy, but jealousy only becomes destructive when the relationship already contains insecurity. The rival is the spark. The emotional fuel was already there. Nick's reactions become increasingly difficult to separate from his protective instincts. He has learned to associate love with responsibility and danger with the need to intervene. Noah, meanwhile, has learned to associate dependence with vulnerability. Their coping mechanisms collide. The person who feels threatened becomes controlling. The person who feels controlled becomes defensive. The defensive reaction then appears suspicious to the controlling partner, which causes even more control. This circular pattern is the psychological engine beneath much of the sequel. That is why the honeymoon phase gradually mutates into mistrust. Nothing needs to happen all at once. The damage accumulates through small moments. A withheld truth, a suspicious encounter, a half-explained decision, a conversation interrupted before it reaches clarity, a question answered defensively. The movie understands that trust rarely collapses because of one event alone. Usually, one event simply becomes the final piece of evidence supporting fears that have been building for weeks. As the relationship becomes more unstable, the world around Noah and Nick becomes faster and louder. Underground racing, parties, social competition, and career pressures provide the film with external motion that mirrors their internal acceleration. Cars are particularly useful because they turn emotion into velocity. A character can feel trapped while simultaneously moving at extraordinary speed. That contradiction is central to the film's identity. Noah and Nick are constantly moving forward, yet emotionally they keep circling the same unresolved questions. The racing and party subplots also expand the fantasy element of the story. Culpa Tuya does not present adulthood as a quiet transition. It presents it as an accelerated playground filled with wealth, danger, attraction, and consequences. That exaggeration is part of its appeal. For a younger audience, these environments transform ordinary emotional problems into cinematic stakes. The question, "Can I trust you?" becomes a night of speed, noise, strangers, and temptation. The emotional experience is recognizable even when the circumstances are extravagant. But beneath the spectacle, the relationship is beginning to fracture. Jealousy becomes increasingly deliberate. Third parties do not merely appear. They sometimes understand exactly what effect their presence can have. A glance can be enough. Flirtation can be enough. A secret can be enough. The film does not require every rival to be genuinely dangerous, because Noah and Nick are already primed to interpret ambiguity as threat. This makes the audience complicit. We are also encouraged to wonder whether what we see means what it appears to mean. That uncertainty is one of the sequel's most effective retention mechanisms. The viewer is constantly forced to ask, is this betrayal real? Is someone manipulating the situation? Is Noah overreacting? Is Nick hiding something? Is this character genuinely interested? Or are they simply provoking jealousy? The film turns romantic insecurity into a mystery structure. Instead of asking only what will happen, we ask what is actually happening. The problem is that Noah and Nick increasingly stop communicating before they have enough information to answer those questions. Their emotional responses become faster than their rational ones. This is where the film's pacing and psychology intersect. Rapid editing can make events feel immediate, but the characters themselves also react immediately. There is less time to process, less time to ask, and less time to forgive. Noah begins withdrawing when she feels misunderstood. Nick becomes more intense when he feels excluded. Each reaction confirms the other's fear. Noah's withdrawal looks like secrecy to Nick. Nick's intensity looks like control to Noah. The audience can see that both interpretations contain some truth, which makes the conflict more compelling than a simple hero versus villain structure. Eventually, the first major communication breakdown becomes impossible to ignore. They are no longer fighting over a single event. They are fighting over what their relationship means. Noah wants to prove that she can belong to someone without belonging to them completely. Nick wants to prove that protecting someone is part of loving them. Those positions are not inherently incompatible, but the characters express them through behavior that makes compromise increasingly difficult. And that is the point where the sequel's emotional architecture moves into its most dangerous phase. The external world has stopped being the primary threat. The real threat is interpretation. Every character sees the same relationship through a different lens, and once those lenses become distorted by fear, even love can look like evidence against itself. The midpoint crisis arrives when secrets can no longer remain separate from consequences. What has been hinted at, suspected, or hidden begins to collide in ways that force Noah and Nick to confront the possibility that the relationship they have been defending may not exist in the form they imagined. This is the moment when the fantasy of us against the world begins to break. Because if every outside person is an enemy, the couple can always unite against them. But what happens when the person standing opposite you is the person you once trusted most? The major confrontations work because they compress multiple emotional arguments into single moments. Past wounds, present jealousy, family pressure, and personal insecurity suddenly occupy the same space. A character may be technically arguing about one action, while emotionally arguing about years of abandonment, betrayal, or fear. That is why the fights feel larger than the immediate trigger. The trigger is only the visible surface. For Noah, the most painful possibility is not simply that Nick could be interested in someone else. It is that trusting him could make her vulnerable again. Her history has taught her that people who promise safety can also become sources of danger. So when trust breaks, she does not simply lose confidence in Nick. She loses confidence in her own judgment. She begins asking whether she was foolish to believe that this relationship could be different. Nick experiences the rupture differently. His fear is tied to losing control over something he considers precious. He has built an identity around being capable, powerful, and emotionally guarded. Noah's unpredictability exposes the weakness underneath that identity. If he cannot protect the relationship, what does that say about him? The answer he reaches is often the wrong one. He tries harder to control the circumstances. This creates one of the sequel's most important contradictions. The harder Nick tries to prevent loss, the more his behavior can contribute to the very distance he fears. Protection becomes pressure. Concern becomes surveillance. Love becomes a demand for certainty that no human relationship can provide. The betrayal that emerges from this environment is therefore devastating whether every suspicion proves true or not. Perceived betrayal can be almost as powerful as actual betrayal, because relationships are built on interpretation. Once trust disappears, facts lose their stabilizing power. The injured person no longer asks only what happened. They ask what else they have not been told. This is why the emotional collapse feels like a transformation rather than a simple plot twist. Earlier, Noah and Nick could tell themselves that their relationship was special, because they had survived everyone else's objections. Now they have to confront a much harder possibility. Maybe the greatest threat to their relationship is not the people who oppose it, but the emotional patterns they bring into it. The film's language changes accordingly. Intimate scenes become heavier. Physical closeness no longer automatically signals safety. Touch can become confrontation. Silence can become accusation. A room that once represented privacy can become a place of emotional imprisonment. The same relationship that generated the movie's romantic fantasy now generates its anxiety. This is the moment when us against the world becomes us against each other. And once the couple reaches that point, the climax has no choice but to become physical as well as emotional. Kolpatuya has always existed in a world where feelings are expressed through movement, speed, confrontation, and spectacle. So when the final conflicts arrive, the film combines romantic heartbreak with physical danger. The emotional stakes are no longer abstract. Characters are forced to make decisions under pressure, and those decisions reveal what they truly value when the fantasy collapses. The high-octane climax works because action and romance are not treated as separate genres. The danger externalizes the emotional state. Speed represents panic. Pursuit represents obsession. Barriers represent separation. Sudden stops represent the consequences of impulsive decisions. The physical world becomes an extension of the character's psychological condition. Yet the climax does not magically solve everything. That is essential for a second chapter. A trilogy middle film cannot close every emotional door without weakening the final installment. Kolpatuya therefore gives its characters moments of realization, without granting them complete resolution. Noah must confront what she wants independently of what others expect from her. Nick must face the difference between loving someone and controlling the conditions under which they love him. Their individual growth begins precisely because their shared fantasy has been damaged. The aftermath matters because it allows the audience to see the cost of everything that came before. The relationship cannot simply return to its starting point. Too much has been revealed. Too many boundaries have been crossed. Too many assumptions have been challenged. Even moments of reconciliation carry the memory of what happened. And then the final movement of the film does what a middle chapter is designed to do. It opens the future rather than closing the past. The cliffhanger surrounding Culpa Nuestra is not simply a marketing device. Structurally, it reflects the unfinished psychological problem at the center of the trilogy. Noah and Nick have not yet answered whether their connection can evolve beyond intensity. They have only discovered how much damage remains beneath it. That makes the ending both frustrating and strategically effective. The audience is left without complete emotional closure, because the characters themselves have not achieved it. The story has moved forward, but the central question remains alive. Can two people who have learned to survive through emotional extremes learn to build something stable? To answer that, we have to stop treating Noah as merely the romantic heroine and examine the psychological architecture that drives her decisions. On the surface, Noah's goal is straightforward. She wants independence. University represents a chance to build a life defined by her own choices, rather than by family history. She wants success, autonomy, and the freedom to become someone who is not permanently defined by what happened to her. But beneath that visible goal lies a much more complicated need: emotional security. Noah's greatest contradiction is that she desperately wants independence, while simultaneously fearing abandonment. These desires can coexist, but they create tension in almost every major decision she makes. She wants to prove she can stand alone. Yet when the people she loves become emotionally distant, that independence can suddenly feel like isolation. She wants to set boundaries, yet she can also struggle to distinguish a healthy boundary from a defensive wall. This is why her relationship with Nick becomes so psychologically intense. He represents both safety and danger. He is someone who understands parts of her that others do not, but he is also someone whose emotional intensity can make her feel trapped. The same person can therefore activate both sides of her personality: the woman who wants closeness and the woman who fears what closeness costs. Her past trauma reinforces this conflict. People who have experienced instability often become highly sensitive to signs of rejection. That does not mean every decision is caused directly by trauma, but it means certain situations carry more emotional weight than they would otherwise. A delayed response can become more than a delayed response. A change in tone can feel like the beginning of abandonment. A partner's independence can feel like emotional distance. The sequel repeatedly places Noah in precisely those situations. Her defensive independence gradually begins to morph into hypervulnerability. The paradox is that the more she cares about Nick, the harder it becomes to maintain the detached identity she wants to project. She cannot simply walk away because the relationship matters too much. But she also cannot surrender completely because dependence threatens the autonomy she has fought to build. This creates a pattern of self-protection followed by emotional exposure. Noah pushes away, then seeks reassurance. She questions Nick, then fears the consequences of questioning him. She demands honesty, but sometimes protects herself by withholding information. None of this makes her a villain. It makes her psychologically inconsistent in a way that resembles real people more than idealized romance heroes. But realism and health are not the same thing. A behavior can be psychologically understandable and still destructive. Culpa Tuya often walks that line. It asks the audience to understand Noah's reactions without necessarily presenting every reaction as correct. That distinction is important because the film's emotional perspective can sometimes make harmful behavior feel romantic simply because it is intense. Her boundary issues are particularly revealing. Noah's desire for control over her own life is legitimate, but boundaries become complicated when she uses them primarily as tests. A boundary says, "This is what I need." A test says, "Prove that you love me by behaving exactly as I hope." The latter creates instability because the other person can never know whether they are respecting a boundary or failing an invisible examination. Noah sometimes becomes caught between those two modes. Her self-sabotage also comes from the belief that pain can be prevented if she anticipates it first. If she expects betrayal, then betrayal cannot surprise her. If she leaves first, she cannot be abandoned. If she distrusts first, she cannot be fooled. This is emotionally understandable but ultimately self-defeating. The strategy protects her from vulnerability by also preventing genuine security. That makes her arc one of the most important in the film. Noah is not simply learning how to love Nick. She is learning whether she can trust herself enough to love anyone without turning fear into evidence. Nick presents the mirror image of the same problem. If Noah protects herself by creating emotional distance, Nick protects himself through control. His public persona is built around confidence, danger, competence, and self-assurance. He often appears to be the person in the room who knows exactly what to do. But that confidence becomes unstable whenever he faces something he cannot control emotionally. Noah is the ultimate example because she cannot be managed through strength. She can only be trusted. That distinction is difficult for Nick. His protective instincts are genuine. He wants Noah to be safe. He wants to shield her from people and situations he believes could hurt her. But the film repeatedly complicates those instincts by showing how easily protection can become possession. When fear rises, Nick's first response is often to increase control rather than increase communication. That makes him simultaneously hero and emotional antagonist. He is not an antagonist because he wants Noah to suffer. He becomes antagonistic when his fear leads him to behave in ways that undermine her autonomy. This is an especially useful dramatic role because the audience can understand his intentions while still recognizing the consequences of his actions. His public bad boy persona also functions as armor. If he looks dangerous, he does not have to look vulnerable. If he is the person everyone fears, he does not have to admit what he fears himself. The private Nick is far less stable. He worries about losing Noah, about failing expectations, about being betrayed, and about discovering that the emotional control he performs in public does not exist internally. That is why Noah and Nick work as thematic mirrors. Both are afraid of abandonment. Both have difficulty trusting. Both use defensive strategies. The difference is how those strategies manifest. Noah tends toward withdrawal and self-protection. Nick tends toward pursuit and control. When those two patterns collide, they create a feedback loop that feels almost inevitable. One person retreats. The other follows. The more the second person follows, the more the first retreats. The more the first retreats, the more the second believes pursuit is necessary. This is the architecture of codependency. The movie does not necessarily label it in those clinical terms, but the pattern is visible. Their relationship provides emotional highs that temporarily relieve insecurity, which then makes the next low feel even more painful. Reconciliation becomes euphoric because separation feels catastrophic. The cycle itself becomes reinforcing. That is why the story can feel addictive to watch. The audience experiences the same emotional rhythm from the outside. Conflict creates anticipation. Anticipation creates anxiety. Anxiety creates relief when the couple reconnects. Relief creates attachment to the next conflict. The storytelling structure and the relationship structure begin mirroring one another. The supporting cast exists largely to disturb that cycle, reveal it, or provide alternative perspectives. Parents are particularly important because they represent the older generation's complicated relationship with morality. They establish boundaries while frequently failing to model the emotional honesty they demand from Noah and Nick. Their hypocrisy is not always intentional, but it is dramatically useful. They want the younger characters to behave responsibly while surrounding them with secrets, contradictions, and unresolved histories. This creates an environment where young adulthood is framed as both freedom and surveillance. Secondary love interests and outsiders function differently. They are not necessarily important because they are better romantic options. Their structural purpose is to test loyalty. They introduce the possibility that Noah or Nick could choose someone else, but more importantly, they reveal how the central couple reacts when that possibility appears. A healthy relationship should survive the existence of attractive alternatives, because trust does not require the absence of temptation. In Culpa Tuya, however, temptation often becomes a referendum on love. That is one reason the relationship feels so unstable. The characters are repeatedly forced to prove what should ideally already be understood. Friends provide another function. Against the intensity of the central romance, secondary friendships can offer moments of normalcy, humor, and perspective. They remind the audience that life is supposed to contain more than romantic crisis. When those characters act as moral compasses, they expose how extreme Noah and Nick's behavior has become. This ensemble balance is important because without it, the film could become emotionally exhausting. Comedy and friendship create breathing room. They also provide contrast. A healthy interaction placed beside an unhealthy romantic argument allows the audience to recognize the difference without the film needing to lecture. The parents, rivals, and friends therefore form a social mirror around Noah and Nick. Each group reflects a different possibility: control, temptation, stability, freedom. The central couple remains caught between them. And that brings us to the central thematic question: when does passionate love stop being passion and become destruction? Culpa Tuya repeatedly refuses to draw a clean line. Passion is presented as exhilarating because it makes ordinary life feel extraordinary. Noah and Nick do not simply like each other. They are overwhelmed by each other. Their attraction changes how they experience space, time, danger, and even identity. But the same intensity that creates emotional highs can also create emotional dependency. If one person becomes responsible for making the other feel alive, secure, or complete, the relationship begins carrying a burden that no relationship can safely carry. That is the difference between passion and codependency. Passion says, "I want you." Codependency begins to say, "I cannot function without you behaving exactly as I need." The movie's emotional power comes from living in the uncomfortable space between those statements. Family legacy deepens the problem. Noah and Nick do not enter the relationship as blank slates. They inherit patterns from the adults around them. Secrets, failed relationships, emotional neglect, control, betrayal, and unresolved trauma shape the environment in which they learn what love means. Breaking inherited patterns, therefore, becomes part of the story, even when the characters are not consciously discussing it. They are trying to create something better while carrying the tools of the people who taught them how to survive. That is why adulthood feels so uncertain. They have more freedom than before, but freedom without emotional maturity can become another form of instability. They can make their own choices, but they cannot yet predict the consequences of those choices. The illusion of control is everywhere. Nick believes he can control threats. Noah believes she can control vulnerability through independence. Their families believe they can control behavior through rules. The social world believes wealth can control consequences. But the film repeatedly demonstrates that control is temporary. People make their own decisions. Feelings change. Secrets surface. Accidents happen. Trust cannot be forced. The visual language reinforces these themes. Warm tones often accompany intimacy, comfort, and moments when Noah and Nick appear emotionally connected. Cooler or more sterile spaces tend to emphasize distance, secrecy, or uncertainty. The contrast does not need to be literal in every frame to be meaningful. Cinema trains viewers to associate temperature with emotional atmosphere, and Culpa Tuya uses that vocabulary effectively. When the characters are emotionally synchronized, the world can feel soft and enclosed. When they become suspicious of one another, environments feel larger, colder, and less forgiving. This creates an important paradox. Intimacy can make the world feel smaller, while conflict makes the world feel enormous. Cars and racing are perhaps the most obvious metaphor. Speed represents emotional momentum. Noah and Nick often move faster than they think. They make decisions before processing them. They accelerate toward consequences and only slow down once damage has already occurred. A car also offers an illusion of control. The driver chooses the direction, the speed, and the route. Yet the faster the vehicle moves, the smaller the margin for error becomes. That is almost a perfect metaphor for Nick and Noah's relationship. The intensity makes them feel powerful until one mistake creates irreversible consequences. Water and reflective surfaces introduce another layer. Reflections suggest divided identity. A character sees themselves while simultaneously seeing an image that is not quite the same as reality. Noah and Nick are constantly negotiating between who they believe they are and who their behavior reveals them to be. They want to see themselves as independent, loyal, protective, and romantic. The reflection sometimes shows something more complicated. Frightened, possessive, defensive people who are not yet capable of sustaining the ideals they claim to value. Mirrors also suggest the problem of dual lives. Public and private identities coexist. The confident person others see may be terrified inside. The independent woman Noah wants to become may still be carrying the frightened girl she used to be. The romantic hero Nick performs may conceal someone deeply afraid of losing control. The film's deeper meaning emerges from this contradiction. Why do stories like this resonate so strongly with young audiences? Because extreme emotional narratives offer a form of escapism. Real relationships are often ambiguous, slow, and frustrating. Culpa Tuya transforms those frustrations into cinematic events. Instead of wondering whether someone likes your message, the characters race through cities, confront rivals, attend extravagant parties, and make decisions with enormous consequences. It is fantasy, but the emotional language remains recognizable. The wealth surrounding the characters adds another layer. Luxury can create the impression that these people possess every resource necessary for happiness. Yet the film repeatedly shows emotional neglect existing inside material abundance. Expensive homes cannot guarantee trust. Beautiful cars cannot eliminate insecurity. Social status cannot heal trauma. That contrast is particularly useful because it prevents the fantasy from becoming purely aspirational. The characters have access to things many viewers do not, but they still experience fears almost everyone understands. The philosophical question beneath the entire story is therefore simple but difficult. Can destructive passion become sustainable love? The movie does not provide a definitive answer. Instead, it demonstrates how difficult the transition can be. Passion thrives on uncertainty. Sustainable love requires stability. Passion can survive on secrecy. Sustainable love requires honesty. Passion can interpret jealousy as proof of importance. Sustainable love requires trust without constant testing. That is the psychological transformation the characters have not completed. And the production itself helps communicate that struggle. Culpa Tuya's visual polish is one of the reasons its melodrama feels larger than a conventional television romance. The camera understands that romantic storytelling depends on proximity. Tight close-ups place the audience directly inside emotional confrontations. When Noah and Nick argue, the frame can compress the distance between them, making every glance and hesitation feel significant. In action or party sequences, wider compositions expand the world, allowing the characters to become small pieces inside environments filled with movement. That contrast creates rhythm. Close framing says, "This is personal." Wide framing says, "The world is bigger than you." The film constantly moves between those two ideas. Lighting also contributes to the emotional temperature. Night sequences are especially useful because darkness allows characters to conceal information, while high-contrast lighting makes faces and spaces feel fragmented. The characters can be physically visible, while emotionally unreadable. That is exactly what the story requires during periods of mistrust. Editing provides another layer. Action scenes rely on rapid cuts, movement, and sensory information. Romantic scenes often allow longer moments to breathe. This contrast prevents the film from becoming visually monotonous and reinforces the difference between external adrenaline and internal vulnerability. The editing also mirrors emotional perception. When characters feel overwhelmed, the world seems to accelerate. When they are emotionally exposed, time appears to slow. The viewer does not simply understand the characters' emotions intellectually. The film manipulates duration so that we experience a version of them. Directorial staging is equally important. Where Noah stands in relation to Nick can communicate more than dialogue. A character moving toward another can represent pursuit. A character turning away can represent defense. A physical barrier can symbolize emotional separation. A crowded room can isolate two people even when they are surrounded by others. This is particularly useful in romantic cinema, because chemistry is not created only through dialogue. It is created through distance, timing, eye contact, hesitation, and physical rhythm. The lead performances therefore carry enormous responsibility. Noah and Nick need to feel attracted to one another, even when they are angry. If the chemistry disappears during conflict, the audience stops believing that the relationship matters. The performances must communicate simultaneous emotions: desire and resentment, fear and attraction, love and frustration. That duality is one of the film's strongest performance mechanisms. The characters do not simply move from love to anger. They often experience both at the same time. Music intensifies that contradiction. Romantic themes can function almost like emotional signatures. When a particular musical texture appears around Noah and Nick, it reminds the audience of the relationship's emotional identity, even before the characters say anything. Music can also manipulate expectation. A tender cue can make a scene feel romantic before the audience understands what is happening. A darker variation of that sound can transform the same relationship into something ominous. Silence is equally important. When the score disappears, emotional drops can become more severe. A character's breathing, footsteps, a door closing, or a vehicle engine suddenly becomes louder because there is nothing competing with it. Silence creates intimacy but can also create claustrophobia. During racing or high-stress moments, sound becomes physical. Engines, tires, impacts, voices, and environmental noise create sensory pressure. The audience does not simply see speed, they hear it. Licensed pop and contemporary tracks perform another function. They connect the fictional world to the audience's real musical culture. A song can become an emotional shortcut. Instead of the film explaining what a character cannot say, the lyrics can express the feeling indirectly. This is especially powerful for younger audiences because songs already function as personal emotional language. People attach memories to music. A track heard during a relationship can become inseparable from that relationship. The film exploits the same mechanism. That makes the soundtrack part of the franchise's cultural circulation. A scene can be remembered because of the song attached to it. A song can then circulate independently on social media and lead people back to the scene. The soundscape therefore extends beyond the movie itself. And this is where Culpa Tuya's cultural impact becomes impossible to separate from its narrative structure. When the film reaches audiences globally, its most important scenes do not remain inside the feature. They become clips, edits, reaction moments, debates, memes, fan theories, and romantic compilations. TikTok is particularly powerful because it turns emotional fragments into discovery tools. A viewer may encounter Noah and Nick in a 30-second edit before ever watching the full film. The fragment creates curiosity. Curiosity creates a stream. This reverses the traditional relationship between marketing and viewing. The trailer is no longer necessarily the first introduction. Fan edit might be. A reaction might be. A song might be. A single emotionally charged scene can become the advertisement. That is why online fandom matters so much to a property like Culpa Tuya. The audience does not merely consume the relationship. It participates in interpreting it. Fans debate whether Noah was right. They defend Nick. They criticize him. They compare the adaptation to the books. They celebrate chemistry. They complain about changes. Even disagreement becomes engagement. The book-to-screen relationship creates another layer of conversation. Fans often arrive with a mental version of the story already installed. Every adaptation choice becomes a comparison. Was this scene faithful? Was this character represented correctly? Was this emotional moment stronger or weaker on screen? Those questions can create controversy, but controversy itself can sustain attention. The most viral moments usually contain emotional clarity. A kiss, confrontation, betrayal, reveal, or dramatic decision can be understood without the full context. That makes it ideal for short-form circulation. And once those moments circulate, the film becomes culturally larger than its runtime. Long-term, this contributes to the growing internationalization of streaming romance. Culpa Tuya reinforces the idea that a romantic saga does not need to originate inside Hollywood to become globally relevant. Spanish-language stories can travel because emotional structures cross borders. The specific culture matters, but it does not prevent identification. The success of the Culpables model also has implications for Wattpad and Webtoon adaptations. Platforms and studios can look at online communities differently when they recognize that an established digital audience is not merely a group of readers. It is a pre-existing marketing network, a feedback mechanism, and a source of cultural momentum. The franchise also demonstrates the value of multi-film storytelling. A single adaptation can create awareness, but multiple installments create a reason to remain invested. The audience is not only waiting for the next story, it is waiting for the resolution of an emotional relationship. That creates powerful retention, which brings us to the divide between critics and audiences. Professional critics often evaluate romantic melodrama through a different framework than dedicated fans. Critics may focus on formula, dialogue, character logic, pacing, originality, and thematic subtlety. Fans may care more about chemistry, emotional payoff, favorite characters, fantasy, and whether the story makes them feel something intensely. Neither side is automatically wrong. Criticism of Culpa Tuya's reliance on familiar tropes is legitimate. The story uses jealousy, secrets, forbidden attraction, wealthy characters, dangerous situations, rivals, misunderstandings, and emotional reversals. Many of these devices are familiar enough to predict. But predictability does not automatically equal failure. Genre audiences often return precisely because they understand the emotional contract. They know what kind of experience they are seeking. A romance fan may not want a story that dismantles every romantic convention. They may want those conventions executed with enough chemistry and momentum to feel satisfying. Culpa Tuya understands that. Its defenders can therefore argue that emotional effectiveness is itself a legitimate artistic quality. If a film creates strong attachment, sustains attention, generates conversation, and produces memorable character dynamics, dismissing it simply because it is melodramatic becomes another kind of critical blind spot. The more serious criticism concerns what the movie romanticizes. Jealousy can be framed as proof of love. Possessiveness can be framed as protection. Boundary violations can be framed as passion. Communication failures can be transformed into dramatic foreplay. This is where the film becomes ethically complicated. A fictional story does not have to provide relationship advice. Audiences are capable of enjoying unhealthy fictional dynamics without copying them. But representation still matters because repeated cultural patterns can influence what audiences recognize as romantic. The stepbrother premise creates an additional controversy. The story intentionally positions Noah and Nick inside a morally uncomfortable structure, but the narrative does not treat their relationship as a straightforward sibling relationship. Their attraction is built around prohibition and family complication rather than biological relation. That distinction may satisfy some viewers while remaining uncomfortable for others. The important point is that the controversy is part of the design. The forbidden element raises stakes. It makes every romantic decision feel socially consequential. But the same mechanism can also overshadow deeper character development. This is why the best way to evaluate Culpa Tuya is not to ask whether the relationship is healthy enough to imitate. It is to ask whether the film understands the difference between fantasy and reality. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it leans so heavily into emotional reward that the distinction becomes blurry. That ambiguity is part of what makes the movie worth analyzing. And from a business perspective, that ambiguity is valuable. Culpa Tuya is not a conventional box office story. Its commercial logic belongs to streaming, where success is measured through global viewing behavior, audience engagement, completion, repeat viewing, and the ability to keep subscribers connected to a franchise. The platform does not need every viewer to agree that the film is a masterpiece. It needs enough people to press play and enough fans to care about what happens next. That makes a mid-budget international romance potentially extremely efficient. Instead of spending enormous sums on a single global spectacle, a streaming service can invest in stories with strong existing audiences, recognizable emotional structures, and franchise potential. The Culpables films fit that model unusually well. A multi-part romantic saga also creates a subscription strategy. If viewers know that the story continues, the platform has an incentive to keep them engaged across multiple releases. The emotional cliffhanger becomes a business mechanism. The unresolved relationship is not just a narrative problem. It is a reason to return. That changes how studios may think about YA content. Traditional Hollywood has increasingly struggled with the old formula of expensive young adult adaptations built around theatrical releases. International streaming romances offer another route. Online fiction communities can identify audience demand before a studio invests heavily. Streaming can then distribute the finished product globally without requiring every market to justify a theatrical opening. The result is a shift from "can this become a Hollywood franchise?" to "can this become a global streaming community?" That is a major difference. It also encourages accelerated production strategies. If a studio knows the emotional demand exists, it can plan multiple installments early, preserve cast continuity, and reduce the risk of losing momentum between films. In that sense, Culpa Tuya belongs to a broader industry transformation in which romance is no longer necessarily treated as secondary programming. It can become franchise architecture. And culturally, that places the film inside a longer Spanish tradition. Spanish television and cinema have spent decades producing youth dramas capable of crossing borders. Series such as Elite demonstrated how Spanish-language stories could become international cultural events, while earlier romantic dramas helped establish a tradition of heightened emotion, attractive ensembles, social class conflict, and young characters navigating adult consequences. Culpa Tuya continues that trajectory but adapts it to the streaming era. Its defining feature is not simply Spanish identity. It is the ability to package a distinctly Spanish-language romantic saga inside a format that travels globally with almost no cultural translation required. This makes it a useful marker of mid-2020 streaming culture. The global audience no longer needs a story to be produced in English before considering it mainstream. The platform itself has become the bridge. Subtitles and dubbing reduce the language barrier, while social media provides the emotional translation. A romantic scene can become viral before a viewer even understands every word. That is a profound change in how international pop culture travels. The question then becomes whether Culpa Tuya will remain interesting after the trends surrounding it disappear. Some elements are likely to age better than others. The emotional core has the strongest chance of surviving. Chemistry is difficult to date. The basic fear of losing someone you love is timeless. The tension between independence and intimacy is timeless. The struggle to escape family patterns is timeless. Other elements will inevitably stamp the film in its era. The music will identify its cultural moment. The social media aesthetics will date it. The technology characters use will become increasingly recognizable as belonging to the 2020s. Even certain fashion and editing choices will eventually look like artifacts of a specific streaming period. But that does not necessarily reduce rewatch value. Nostalgia often works because we can see the period embedded in the story. Future viewers may watch Culpa Tuya not only to experience Noah and Nick's relationship, but also to understand what romantic fantasy looked like in the middle of the 2020s. They may find some tropes excessive. They may question the relationship dynamics. They may laugh at technology that once felt contemporary. But they may still respond to the emotional architecture. That is what gives the movie its strongest form of longevity. As the middle chapter of the Culpables trilogy, Culpa Tuya is not designed to be perfect. Its purpose is escalation. The first chapter creates the attraction. The second chapter tests whether attraction can survive reality. The final chapter must determine what remains after everything has been tested. That makes Culpa Tuya structurally dependent on conflict. Its repetition is therefore both a weakness and a necessity. The movie sometimes pushes its characters through complications that feel engineered. But without those complications, the trilogy would have nowhere to go. The question is whether the escalation produces transformation. In some places it does. Noah becomes more aware of her own emotional contradictions. Nick's vulnerabilities become harder to hide. Their relationship loses some of its idealized innocence and becomes more psychologically complicated. But the film does not completely resolve those contradictions because it cannot. The final chapter still needs them. That leads to the final verdict. As an independent film, Culpa Tuya is uneven. Its plot can become overstuffed. Its characters sometimes behave according to the demands of melodrama, rather than the logic of healthy communication. Some twists feel designed primarily to generate emotional shock. The film occasionally mistakes escalation for depth, but as a sequel inside a romance franchise, it is remarkably effective at what it sets out to accomplish. It expands the emotional stakes. It deepens the central relationship. It introduces new sources of conflict. It transforms attraction into dependency. And most importantly, it makes the audience care about what happens next. Technically, the movie benefits from polished cinematography, committed performances, strong visual contrast, energetic editing, and a soundtrack designed for emotional circulation. Its greatest achievement may not be originality but synchronization. Story, visuals, music, performances, marketing, and fandom all operate around the same emotional product. Noah and Nick. That synchronization explains why the film can feel larger than its individual scenes. It is not merely telling a story. It is creating an emotional environment. And that environment is why different viewers can walk away with completely different conclusions. One person sees a passionate love story. Another sees a portrait of codependency. Another sees escapist melodrama. Another sees a fascinating example of streaming culture. All of those interpretations can coexist because the film itself contains the contradiction. My overall judgment is therefore not that Culpa Tuya is flawless, nor that it deserves to be dismissed as guilty pleasure fluff. It is more interesting than either label suggests. As a piece of romantic filmmaking, it understands spectacle. As a character study, it understands emotional insecurity. As an adaptation, it understands the value and limitations of translating internal fiction into visual language. As a streaming product, it understands exactly how to turn emotional uncertainty into audience retention. And as the second chapter of a trilogy, it understands the most important rule of middle acts. Sometimes the purpose is not to make the audience feel complete. The purpose is to make them need the ending. That is precisely where Culpa Tuya leaves us. Because underneath the cars, parties, betrayals, beautiful locations, jealousy, music, and dramatic confrontations is a much simpler human question. What happens when the person who makes you feel safest is also the person capable of making you feel most vulnerable? Noah and Nick never stop wanting each other. Their problem is that wanting someone is not the same as knowing how to love them. That distinction is why their story remains so emotionally addictive. We are fascinated by dramatic love stories because they exaggerate something ordinary. Most people know what it feels like to fear losing someone. Most people understand the temptation to seek reassurance. Most people have experienced the distance between what they intended to say and what another person heard. Culpa tuya takes those ordinary anxieties and raises the volume until they become cinematic. The fantasy is extreme. The emotion is not. And perhaps that is the real reason these stories continue to work. We do not necessarily watch them because we believe destructive passion is ideal. We watch because they allow us to experience emotional extremes safely. We can enter the jealousy without becoming jealous. We can experience betrayal without actually being betrayed. We can watch someone risk everything for love without having to make the decision ourselves. That is the strange power of melodrama. It turns private fears into public spectacle. Culpa tuya understands that power better than its reputation might suggest. Its weaknesses are obvious. Its strengths are equally obvious. But between those two lies something more valuable. A film that perfectly captures a particular moment in young adult storytelling, where online fandom, streaming economics, international romance, visual spectacle, and psychological fantasy all collide. The result is messy. It is excessive. It is sometimes frustrating. And it is undeniably compelling. So if you came to Culpa tuya expecting a simple continuation of Noah and Nick's romance, the film gives you something more complicated. It gives you a relationship beginning to discover the cost of the fantasy that created it. And if you came expecting nothing more than melodrama, you may have missed the most interesting part. Because the real story is not whether Noah and Nick love each other. They clearly do. The real story is whether love by itself is enough to save two people who have not yet learned how to feel safe without controlling each other. That is the question the sequel leaves hanging over everything that comes next. And now I want to hear your answer. Was Noah justified in the choices she made? Or did her fear of abandonment push her into decisions that made everything worse? Was Nick genuinely trying to protect the person he loved? Or did his need for control become another form of emotional harm? And most importantly, do you think Noah and Nick's relationship represents passionate love, codependency, or some uncomfortable combination of both? Drop your take in the comments because that debate is at the heart of what makes Culpa tuya so fascinating. If you enjoyed this deeper breakdown, subscribe for more cinematic analyses that go beyond simply explaining what happened and explore why these stories affect us the way they do. And if you want another film breakdown that combines plot, psychology, symbolism, production, and cultural impact, check out the next video on the channel. Because sometimes the most interesting thing about a movie is not the story it tells us. It is the reason we cannot stop watching it.